Biodiversity, Lesson 1.7, Kingdom Animalia. So this was going to be a little bit more of a longer lesson because there's so much information to cover for this. So Kingdom Animalia. So they're heterotrophic, multicellular eukaryotes that have cells that lack cell walls. And there's 36 phyla, but don't worry, we won't learn all of those. We'll just understand and know the main ones. Most of the animals are diploid, except for some that are haploid eggs, and then of course the sperm. And scientists have developed 3 ways to classify animals in Kingdom Animalia. So we classify them by their symmetry, the tissue layers, and their embryonic development. And this is important because soon things will become very similar to one another. So the only way that we're able to differentiate between them is, for example, knowing that some of them have symmetry and others don't. So that's a very important key. So the first one is symmetry. So we have 2 types of symmetry, radial symmetry and bilateral symmetry. So you can see that with these different types of symmetry, one example of radial symmetry is, of course, the starfish. So if I split this starfish down the center like this, and like this, each of these little sections is going to be the same, that they're going to be equal parts and the same. And I can split it in all different directions, kind of like a star. So that's how I remember radial symmetry. If you look over here at bilateral symmetry, if I split this fly down the middle, he's not exactly going to be the same on each side, but I can split him right down the center. So those are some things to think about. The next way we classify things in Kingdom Animalia is the tissue layers. So of course we have 2 layers, which is diploblastic, and then the other one is 3 layers, is triploblastic. So this is like the amount of tissue an animal has. And then each part has an endoderm and an ectoderm, and here are the different layers. You can see that there's a clear difference between the amount of layers that they have. And let's say, for example, they have 3 layers and a body cavity. This would be known as a coelom. And the last one is embryonic development. So essentially how the zygote starts to develop in the uterus. So we start off with, of course, the zygote and the fertilized egg. Now you don't need to know so much detail about this, but essentially it goes through all of these stages until it comes over here and it starts to form the full what is going to be a baby. And then you can see the endoderm and the ectoderm start to form. And remember on the last slide, we saw that with the endoderm and the ectoderm as our tissue layers. So now that we understand all of the ways that we classify animals, there's also 2 categories that we split them into. So vertebrate and invertebrate. So if you remember learning this all the way back a few years ago, vertebrae have a backbone or like a spine like we have in humans. So if you think about it, that's what helps us sit upright or bend in certain ways. So that's things like mammals, birds, and reptiles. Invertebrate, on the other hand, do not have that. So that's things like insects, worms, or coral. So now we're going to actually start digging down into the different phylum. So I mentioned that there was quite a few, and we're not going to learn them all, but these ones are just the main one. So we'll start off with Phylum Porifera. So these ones are like the most simple that you can go. They mostly include sponges, and they reproduce asexually and sexually by budding. The next one is Phylum Cnidaria, and these are organisms with stingers. They have symmetrical bodies with cells organized into tissues, and it breaks down into these 3 classes. And some of these pictures might look familiar to you. They range in size from microscopic to large jellyfish, and they show radial symmetry. They also all have stinging structures, so that's a key point. And listed here are the 3 classes. So when I'll start to break it down, you'll see I'll write the phylum at the top and then break it down into the 3 classes like we do in those tree charts. And the life cycle of the Cnidarias goes through 2 stages. So it starts off as a polyp, which is asexual reproduction by budding. And then the second part is the medusa. So it floats like a bell with the tentacles down. So if you ever picture a jellyfish kind of floating, you can see that it has the sort of round dome at the top and the tentacles pointing down. Okay, and next we have phylum Platyhelminthes or flatworms. So these are flat-bodied worms with a nervous system and 1 digestive opening. And the 3 classes in this phyla are class Turbellaria, class Tremodota, and class Cestota. So one interesting thing is about class Cestota, and that they are things like tapeworms or parasites, and they can live in your digestive tract and grow up to 40 feet long. So that's just something interesting about class Cestota. Then phylum Nematoda is also a similar type of worm, except they're round worms. So they have a mouth and an anus. They live as scavengers in soils or deep inside lakes and ponds. Many of them are actually parasites, so like pinworms. So if you ever come in contact with these and your food is probably contaminated with it, then you should definitely wash your hands. The next one is Phylum Annelida, and this is kind of the last one for the worms, and it's segmented worms. So if you ever think about like an earthworm, they're segmented in a way that allows them to improve motion so that their body can move in complex ways. So if you ever think about how can worms move like that, now you know it's because of their segmented bodies. And then this breaks down into 3 other classes. So these are just some examples below of the types of segmented worms. You don't necessarily need to know the example, but it's nice to think of something as an example so that when you're making your tree, you don't mix them up. The next one is Phylum Mollusca, or animals with shells. So if you think of things like snails, slugs, clams, squids, things like that. And it breaks down into 3 more classes. So class Bivalva, class Gastropoda, and class Cephalopoda. So those are just some examples below them. The next one is Phylum Echinodermata. And it's essentially organisms that have radial symmetry, and they must also be marine animals. So again, if you remember, we learned at the beginning how we classify things. We talked about radial symmetry. So I can split this starfish all ways, and it's going to look the same when I split it with these tentacles like this. And they also must have an endoskeleton, so an internal skeleton. The next one is Phylum Arthropoda, or joint-legged animals. So if you think of things like insects or spiders, they have joint legs together. So they also have a rigid exoskeleton, and they can occasionally shed. There's an estimated 9 million different types of arthropods that still exist. They also have an open circulatory system, which we'll learn more about in our circulatory unit, but essentially they bathe in their blood. And then there's 5 classes within this phylum. So we have class Arachnida, which is spiders, things like scorpions or mites, and they have 6 pairs of legs. The next one is class Crustacea, or things like crab, lobsters, crayfish, and they have 3 regions of their body: the head, the thorax, and the abdomen, and one way you can identify them is by their little claws. The next class is class Insecta, or insects. They're the most numerous of all the animal species, and they go through some radical changes, for example, like butterflies, metamorphosis. The next one is class Diplopoda. So this is very important. These are millipedes. They have about 100 pairs of legs, and each segment, you remember we talked about segments, have 2 pairs of legs. Class Chilopoda, on the other hand, are centipedes. They have about 10 to 100 pairs of legs, and each segment only has 1 pair of legs. And the last phylum that we're going to talk about today is Phylum Chordata. So this one is a little bit more of the ones that we think about when we think about animals. So we have like things like reptile and birds and amphibians, stuff like that. So it actually breaks down into 6 classes, but I came over here and I broke down the fish into 2 of their own, just so it's a little bit easier to remember. So the first one that we have is class Chondrichthyes, which is things like sharks. So they're a little bit more cartilage and like blubbery. So if you know how it looks when you touch a shark, it kind of has that outer blubber on the top. And then the other one is class Astichthyes, and these are more fish that are scaly and bony. The next one is class Amphibians, and these are things like frogs, salamanders, and most of them live in freshwater, and they're the first vertebrate animals to leave the swamps and come live on land. The next one is class Reptilia, so like alligators, lizards, snakes, and they don't need water to reproduce. Their egg actually has a waterproof shell. The next one is class Aves, or birds, and they lay their eggs and they have feathers to help them prevent loss of body heat. And one interesting thing they do with their eggs is that they sit on them or they incubate them to keep them warm. And the last one is class Mammalia, and this is one that includes humans, so like monkeys, humans, stuff like that. And we generally have body covering of hair, a 4-chambered heart, and specialized teeth to help us eat better. We also give birth to live young. So of course, when you give birth, the baby will be alive when it's born. And the females have mammary glands to produce milk to nourish the young. So then we also break down class Mammalia into 3 divisions. So if you remember our kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, we break it down just a little bit more into 3 more divisions. So we have monotremes, marsupials, and placentals. So monotremes lay eggs, so things like platypi. Marsupials have pouches, so if you think like koalas or kangaroos. And then placentals, obviously like us, we incubate our young in the uterus. And that's it for the breakdown of Kingdom Animalia. You can stop the video here and make your own notes of this chart, but essentially I have created this chart with our kingdom at the top. We break it down into all the phylum that we went over, and you can go back to the other slides to get a little bit more information on those. I also broke it down into the different classes, which is in the blue, and should it have a subdivision like class Mammalia, we have the different subdivisions there. Okay, so thank you for watching.